Thank you, George. Normally, before I give a speech, I check if there are any journalists in the room, just so I can curb what occasionally can be a bit of colourful commentary that I've been known to give. But considering this group and those who are in the room, I'm definitely assuming that this is not off the record. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the original farmers of the land we're on and their elders past and present. Never before in human history have so many people relied on so few to feed them, to produce their food. This is particularly true in modern developed countries such as Australia, where less than half of 1% of the population, those good dedicated women and men on the land, produce the food for the entire other 99.5%. Not only do these farmers keep Australia fed, but their productivity also allows our nation to be a net exporter of agricultural produce. These exports are very important when we consider the extent of hunger in the world today. Only this month, the UN's Food and Agriculture Organisation reported that around 900 million people who share our existence on this planet face severe food insecurity. As such, my starting point in exploring the topic of ESG in Australian agriculture is the call to ensure that its application to farming businesses and food systems is focused on the most important priority of agriculture globally. That is its role of achieving the most fundamental human right of all, ensuring that everyone has enough to eat. The primacy of food security among the world's moral priorities is well established. Take, for example, the Paris Agreement, which sets global ambition of limiting climate change to well below 2% and seeks the achievement of net zero emissions by the second half of this century. The Paris Agreement has been one of the precursors that has led to the increased adoption of ESG, as the community demanded greater accountability of business towards the environmental imperative of mitigating this existential threat of climate change. The agreement not only outlines the imperative of climate change action to protect food security, but also the need to progress towards a low greenhouse gas emissions world, most importantly, in a manner that does not threaten food production. That is not to say the evolution of ESG to assist publicly listed companies to consider their broader environmental, social and governance impacts of their operations is unwarranted or unwelcome for agribusiness or other companies involved in agriculture. As an example from my own industry, in addition to significant regulatory requirement, CropLife Australia's members are required to meet a range of obligations around safety, stewardship and quality as part of our code of conduct. This provides the basis for our members to demonstrate their commitment to the highest of industry standards to the community, setting them apart from others in the sector. And I take this opportunity to acknowledge CropLife's chairman, Mr. Paul Luxton, who's also head of Syngenta Australia and New Zealand, and great that he's here today with us. However, as we continue to see the development of ESG as a baked-in component of business operations, not only for our commercial world, but indeed our food systems, the question becomes, how do we ensure that ESG fulfills its potential to be a useful tool for progressing societal ambitions, such as human rights and the Sustainable Development Goals? The answer to this question is that in order for ESG in agriculture to be a positive force towards environment and social goals, it is important that the best available science guides those practices that markets and value chains demand of farmers. These requirements must not be allowed to be hijacked by any other ideological agenda, particularly by those agendas that are fundamentally opposed to modern agriculture. Too often, we see the political and public discourse around agriculture in a manner that appears to forget that producing food is not optional. For those who have spent more than a few years in agriculture, this feels like an all too familiar battlefront. It is a battle frontlined with affluent activist groups, funded by tax-deductible donations from those with full bellies and designer grocery bags that seek to define what good farming looks like on their own terms that almost exclusively neglect the implications of both food production and the broader global environment. While traditionally this mode of activism can be seen in calls for regulatory action from government, the rise of ESG has seen those groups identify commercial businesses as an additional target. Using this avenue, activist groups look to pressure capital-exposed businesses in the food system and agriculture more broadly, seeking to compel them to use their market power to force conditions upon farmers, ironically, often to measures that will actually diminish and undermine farming's pursuit of greater sustainability. The obligation to deliver upon these new requirements often comes without any accompanying premium to remunerate the farmer for reduced productivity or any additional costs, such as the administration required to verify compliant practices. The additional expenses are increasingly lumped upon farming businesses as merely the price of the ticket to play. More recently, ESG has increasingly fallen into the purview of financial regulation as part of growing requirement upon banks and listed companies to report on the management of ESG performance. Importantly for agriculture, to support these corporate ESG obligations, family farms will increasingly be required to report on their practices back to the banks that hold their loans, or with agribusinesses and food processors that sell their farm commodities too. Although I'm sure those farmers with loans to NAB are very happy, George. Again, if done well, indeed, these measures may well assist with sustainability improvements. ESG reporting has the capacity to focus the minds of boards and executives so that their businesses contribute to the greater good, or at least avoid engaging in business that is harmful to the environment and society. However, often it leaves the regulation of ESG practices in the hands of authorities or commercial businesses that are simply not well equipped to translate it into the needs of actual food production. This risks the responsibility falling into the hands of those who may be led by commercial advantage, or worse, persuaded by ideological arguments rather than science and data. This vacuum of expertise has been accompanied by a proliferation of consulting firms starting up practices in ESG advisory services. These services offer a one-size-fits-all approach that will not necessarily be appropriate for agriculture, recommending businesses deliver a response to any multitude of issues raised by stakeholders, rather than firmly engaging with the community about the scientific basis behind these farming production systems. Given the risk that ESG may be used as a guise for requiring farmers to abandon scientifically proven safe and sustainable farming practices in favour of practices that may be seen as acceptable in popular culture, recommended by consultants following a materiality assessment or driven by activists, it is once again important to focus on the costs of getting ESG wrong. The costs of imposing requirements that arbitrarily restrict the use of modern technologies and innovations developed by the plant science industry, our own and others, in the name of ESG, stretch much further than the farm gate costs of higher operating expenses and lost productivity. They have a deep reach into the world's ability to produce food, impacting on food security of the world's poorest nations and the cost of living through higher global food prices. We should not be surprised that something so well-meaning as ESG targets may well result in poor outcomes if not well directed. After all, while the European Union's Green Deal holds very laudable goals around sustainability, experts are now warning of its seriously negative impacts on global food systems and indeed on the environment. The farm to fork and biodiversity strategies of the EU, which underpin the agricultural components of the Green Deal, seek to limit the use of valuable farm inputs by European agricultural producers. This includes blanket reduction targets of pesticide and fertiliser use by 2030, as opposed to setting genuine production sustainability outcome goals. It also proposes an increase of total farmland under organic production to 25% in the same time frame, which, by any independent assessment, will only diminish farming environmental outcomes. Modelling of the impact of these strategies has already identified that they will reduce European food production by up to 12%, resulting in the EU needing to import more food merely to keep itself fed. This is a substantial reduction, noting that continental Europe is probably the single largest, most productive tract of agricultural land on the planet, and yet they are the world's second largest net importer of food. And quite frankly, that is morally offensive. The additional demand on global markets created by Europe's increased requirements to import food will in turn drive up global food prices by, it's estimated, an additional 9% by 2030, creeping into the grocery bills of even Australian families, with food costs inevitably linked to these global price hikes. From an environmental perspective, Europe's inability to feed itself through its absolute, the greatest Luddites and troglodytes you can run into, but will create greater pressure on... Sorry, I went off script. Watch the panic-stricken faces of CropLife team here. Inability to feed itself will create greater pressure on food production in other nations, requiring more land to be diverted to agriculture in order to meet the shortfall. This land use change not only puts unique natural environments at risk, but also results in greenhouse gas emissions from deforestation, unnecessarily increasing the climate change footprint of global agriculture. And just to quickly go off script again, the classic example here is the EU bans their own farmers from commercial cultivation of GM crops. So they can't grow GM soy, which would give them a massive yield boost, reduce their actual overall footprint. Then at the same time, the EU are outraged that Brazil's clearing out farmland, knocking out forests to produce more farmland. Why? To meet the soybean demand of the European market. The cognitive dissonance of European politicians is genuinely staggering. From an environmental perspective, while these strategies go under the pretense of being part of a Green Deal, the sad fact is that in addition to creating the risk of a green famine, they will also lead, ironically, to worse environmental outcomes. The EU's failure lies in the decision to follow ideological principles and false lifestyle value signalling trends rather than to look to science-based policy settings as a way to create improved environmental outcomes and increase the world's ability to feed itself. This is why Australia's policy settings, which regulate access to agricultural technologies such as crop protection products and biotechnology innovations, are so important. These schemes establish independent science-based regulators, like the APVMA and the Office of Gene Technology Regulator, who then use contemporary science to establish safe and effective conditions of access to these technologies for farmers. This has ensured that Australian farmers have access to the tools that drive innovation and underpin the actual productivity and sustainability of Australian agriculture. The authority of these regulators to make independent scientific decisions based on evidence and data also acts to provide confidence in the safety of these technologies to the broader Australian community and indeed our trading partners. As such, it is fair to say that by ensuring science and not the latest false food fads is at the forefront of these decisions, and by doing that, we have served our farmers and our broader community well. Similarly, it seems eminently sensible that the rise of ESG in agriculture should look to follow the same approach, ensuring that science informs the practices used on farm, and more importantly, that the outcomes that companies seek to report on are objectively measured by genuine goals. At this point, it's probably worth diverting to talk about the actual ESG performance of Australian farmers, at least specifically in the environmental sustainability arena. Earlier this year, the Australian Bureau of Agriculture and Resources, Agricultural Economics and Science, ABARES, published an insights report on environmental sustainability and agri-environmental indicators. Using publicly available and verified independent data, ABARES identified that Australia has very strong sustainability credentials compared to other major agricultural producers. The paper found that Australian farmers were able to increase agricultural production on less land, enabling them to return more land to nature and conservation, are global leaders in the adoption of environmentally friendly practices such as no-till farming and crop rotation, are judicious and responsible users of agricultural chemicals, and produce agricultural commodities with a low greenhouse gas emissions intensity compared to any of our competitors. Through the practices that enabled these sustainable outcomes, Australian farmers have also driven their adaptation to climate change and drought conditions, maximising their water use efficiency in unfavourable seasons and increasing farm resilience to wind and flooding rains and other environmental challenges. Importantly, both these sustainability and productivity outcomes have been achieved through policy settings that are not only encouraged Australian farmers to innovate, but provides them with the access to the tools that enable them to do more innovation, delivering greater sustainability on their own farms and greater profitability. This has allowed Australian agriculture to harness the power of science, like the plant science industry and others, to grow more with less, more profitably and more sustainably. In the same way that the old saying in farming used to be, it's hard to be green when you're in the red, increasing farm business productivity and profitability will assist Australian farmers to meet their social and governance obligations. Profitable farms are more able to make positive contributions to their local communities, better attract, retain and manage employees, and implement the systems of work that keep everyone safe on the farm. In this way, ensuring that any commercial requirements imposed on farmers are science and data-based and that they are properly rewarded for their efforts is critical to facilitating the good implementation and practice of the highest ESG standards. In light of the risks misplaced and flawed ESG initiatives could pose to Australian agriculture, it is pleasing to see the collaboration that industry and the Australian government are pursuing through the Australian Agriculture Sustainability Framework. This collaboration provides the tools that will help to focus value chains on the agriculture ESG outcomes that are consistent with allowing science-based innovation and that recognise beneficial outcomes objectively. In the same vein, it is important that the Australian government continues to reinforce its strong commitment to independent, science-based regulation, not only for agricultural technologies, but also of the trade of agricultural commodities and food more broadly. This includes commitment to the rules-based trade order and supporting initiatives that seek to remove unjustified restrictions to the trade of food and agricultural commodities and promote independent, scientific, risk-based decision-making that supports this trade. A strong government commitment to independent, science-based regulation sends a clear message to the private sector on how it should manage ESG requirements it seeks to impose on farmers and allows for a genuine stability in the operating environment that we are asking them to go forward in. Likewise, it is time for businesses requiring ESG performance and reporting from farmers to ensure these goals are developed using science, not marketing slogans developed by focus groups in inner city cafes. It is only through the power of science that we can deliver the human right of adequate food for all, while also delivering better environmental and social outcomes. Further, these businesses, whether they are banks, retailers, food processors or other, should use their touch points with consumers to responsibly explain farm sustainability in ways that are truthful about the outcomes and explain the value of farm innovation to feeding the world and improving environmental sustainability. And this is becoming even more challenging as we have the vast majority of the population never being so emotionally and intellectually disconnected from how food is actually produced. Although it doesn't stop them being very opinionated and dictating how they'd like it to be done, but challenge for another day. Because ESG has obligations both ways, and consumers need to ensure that they are properly informed before they dictate to farmers of how they should farm. The world has a big task ahead of it. Over the next 50 years, the world's farmers need to produce as much food as we have since the beginning of humanity more than 30,000 years ago if everyone is going to be fed in that period. Vitally, if the world is to rise to the occasion and meet this challenge, we must ensure that all efforts, whether regulation or commercial ESG imperatives, harness the most important science that has ever existed, the science behind farming and food production. Thank you.
Matthew's kindly offered to take questions. If you have any, please just state who you are, where you're from, and please keep them to questions rather than statements. Wouldn't mind. Any questions from the floor?
Thank you, Matthew, for well pointing out that part of Paris is about keeping food equitable to everybody. Stephen Wentworth, Feeding the Future Consulting and Research. European private equity investors are now treating cattle as coal. And the quote's coming back if it's got a heartbeat, they don't want to know about it. Given that most Australian agricultural land is only suitable for pastoral enterprises, how do we maintain and get through that investment period to actually still keep our investment coming in from private equity, maintaining our ESG requirements?
First, we should commend Minister for Ag, federally, Murray Watt, and Minister for Trade, Don Farrell, for the continuity of policy that they brought over from the previous government with regards to their position on the free trade agreement with Europe. They are holding firm. I mean, aside from the fact that the deal is just shit at the moment for Australian farming, there's just not enough in it. The Europeans are conducting themselves, quite frankly, like a trade bully, because they're not just trying to negotiate free trade agreements, they're trying to, at the same time, impose non-science, non-agronomic policies on the farmers of the countries they want to do trade deals with. We've seen them with mirror clauses in terms of regulation in our industry, a whole range of these measures. So it's not that they just want to starve themselves anymore, they want to take us all with them. And I think it's good that the government has held up a position, and particularly Murray Watt, who's said to the Europeans on his most recent trips, we agree with the goals you state. We support them, they're important goals. The difference is we're actually going to do it because the policies we're setting about will achieve that because they're science-based. They're not warped in a city disconnected from reality. You know, whatever the last activist group petition asked us to do. So it's not that we disagree with the goals, as I said in the speech. But the challenge is, it is probably time where agricultural trading countries like Australia need to actually buddy up. Australia, Canada, the US, Argentina, Brazil probably need to come together and say to Europe, no more of warping agricultural policy around the world through your trade bullying. These are the parameters we're going to set. I would leave it to others in the cattle industry to figure out how they're going to forge through that. But quite frankly, my message to Europe is you can't eat coal. And last time I checked, they were one of the world's largest consumers of beef too. And this is this complete disconnect from reality. I mean, you sit there going, they can't possibly be serious because they must know the consequences. But this is the genuine warping of agricultural policy in Europe. And so it's nearly a moral obligation on us all to tell them that they've lost the plot and to push back. And I think us holding firm in free trade agreements and not accepting the dictating that they can tell farmers how to farm here simply because we have a trade agreement is important. But I think we need to be realistic and get essentially a cartel together to push back to say we're happy to be competitive. Goodness knows Australian farmers are happy to be competitive. You know, unlike Europe, our farmers haven't had environmentally destructive subsidies on them for the last 3 decades, as opposed to European farmers. But to start dictating the parameters that they can't keep on using false trade barriers under the guise of regulations around whether it's the use of pesticides or GM or any other technology, and instead set new parameters in which the deals will be done, or more importantly, have to reject the deals, because it's a little self-defeating if the Australian government signs a free trade agreement with Europe for us to be able to sell more agricultural produce to Europe, and at the same time accept conditions that mean Australian farmers won't be able to grow the stuff that we want to export. And that's essentially where the EU free trade agreement is at the moment. And I think Europe needs to start seriously questioning how its public policy around agriculture and perhaps more broadly has been genuinely and unduly influenced and warped by what can only be described as extremist groups who they're not about feeding the world, they're just anti-modern agriculture. And it always seems to be the ones who have more than enough to eat that want to dictate about how we produce food, as opposed to the billion-odd people who don't.
Richard Heath, Australian Farm Institute. You had me right up until the inner city cafes comment, which was 95% of the way through, so well done. But after growing up in the country my whole life, I live in the inner west of Sydney now, and I love my inner city cafes. Absolutely love them. And, you know, it's a serious point about values alignment, because I think it's something we're pretty shit at, to be honest. 100% agree on the science base for everything that we need to do. But you cannot have a scientific discussion unless there's a values alignment first, because you're just butting against each other. We have to have the understanding that we share values, that we share connected values around sustainability, around the environment. And I worry that whenever as an industry, and this is not a comment on your speech in particular, this is a comment about the industry, that whenever
certainly sounding more like a comment than a question, Richard.
Well, it is, but I'll get to it in a minute. Whenever we get defensive, we do get to the values opposition. We do get to the inner city latte sippers. You know, that's our first defensive position, which then immediately loses the value alignment and makes it impossible to have the scientific discussion. So my question is, how do we do the values alignment better?
Thanks, Richard, a good point. And I would just preface that I think you've missed a line in what I said. And that is my criticism on let me broaden it, the inner city, soy latte, organic, kumbaya, hemp weaving cafe latte set. Most of whom are my friends as well. The left of the Labor Party, I have more of them than anyone in the room, I imagine. But it's not that I have a problem with values alignment. I specifically said we do need to do that. They have an obligation, though, to have genuine, informed, science-based values, though. Because if all we're going to do is respond in agricultural policy to warped values that will actually undermine what they genuinely want from farming, then it's self-defeating. It is absolutely, and as I said, ESG in its best form and testament to the Australian ag sector, the big issues have forced us to adjust and change how we farm. It drives good innovation, that contested space. Ag policy for some decades now has been a combination of conflict and consensus. And as long as you take out the extreme sort of activist and screeching out of the debate, there is more consensus. The concern I have, and this is the fundamental problem we have, which you've touched on, and as I mentioned, is never before have we had such a fundamental disconnect and ignorance in the consumer base about farming as we do now. Our generations, you're clearly a lot older than I am, but we all had country cousins. We referred to them. There was at least once a year or two that a city kid would actually figure out where milk genuinely came from and still ate eggs after they saw one laid. That's gone, though. And that is actually, I believe, a serious problem. And the problem is so serious about that ignorance, while at the same time we've never had such an obsession with food. MasterChef and every magazine, there's never been such an obsession about food correlating with such an ignorance around farming. But there is the threat scenario, and I believe it is so significant now, it is one that falls to government. Not just the farming sector, because if we're going to maintain a democratic system and politicians have to respond to their voters, then we need those voters not to be asking them to do really stupid things. Because, there's enough examples in history that if it's the decision between the right thing and a really stupid thing, but gets you re-elected, politicians will always go the stupid thing. So it is a real problem. I don't want a disconnect between our latte sippers in the inner city cafes. I want them to be genuinely informed, because if they were, then they'd be advocating for the same things that the Australian agricultural sector is advocating for. They would recognise the massive leap in sustainability and improvement that Australian farming has done. They would support their access to the judicious use of pesticides. I mean, this is, in our field, we see some of the worst extremes of it. You have people who go, no chemistry, I only eat organic. Oh my God, the amount of chemistry we hit organics with, it's just not synthetic. And this is why we're very apolitical in this. We, as an industry, we support all forms of farming because they're, including the organics, because they're all customers. And if a farmer can pull off a 30% premium for a product that is environmentally worse, relatively probably no difference in nutritional value or quality, simply because the ignorance of a consumer, well done to them, I say. But that ignorance extending to a serious threat to genuine food security is something that governments are going to have to grapple with, because the ag sector has done a lot in pushing social licence, of upgrading standards, of addressing issues, sometimes way too late and they get pinged for it, sometimes well in front and they get no credit for it. But we now have a problem that government is going to have to address that ignorance, because otherwise they are going to have to do things that their voter base just will not understand, and it'll lead to very bad outcomes. And if the practical example is Europe, you can't tell me they don't genuinely know how bad that their initiatives are, and they're just kicking it down the path for someone else to fix. The only problem is there's real consequence. It's all fine for us here with enough to eat over lunch. There's real consequence here. The issue about ag production and profitable ag and productive ag and environmentally sustainable ag is actually, for a large number of people on the planet, a life or death decision.
Matt, Nick Goddard from the Australian Oilseeds Federation, thanks for your presentation. It was excellent, and of course I'd expect nothing less from you. Paradoxically, a lot of the challenges that Australian farmers are facing now around ESG is actually based around fuel. You articulated very clearly it's all about food, and indeed it is all about food, and yet a lot of the pressure is coming from fuel. I'm just wondering how you see this tension between food and fuel going to play out into the future. Thanks.
And it's a broader one. Somebody who spent a bit of time in our industry, and apologies to Paul at Syngenta, I'm going to reference a competitive company here, but Andrew Liveris, a good Northern Territory boy who went on to run one of the world's largest chemical companies in Dow, about 12 years ago was highlighting this issue, particularly to food production and particularly in the Australian context, as he just couldn't believe we've got the largest sort of liquid gas reserves comparatively anywhere in the world, and yet we make ag in Australia buy it at the international retail rate, essentially, one, making our own food production more expensive than it has to, and two, making us less competitive internationally. Now, I don't want, if anyone's from the energy sector here, I'll get lynched because, but all the issues that, people say, well, don't talk about reserves, domestic reserves or anything. Now we're all going, well, why didn't we do that? They are intrinsically linked. And I think there is a balance there where you can see good policy around energy, again connected to the issue of food production, because it's not the optional one, and that's the debate that needs to be had, where good energy policy to support agricultural production that could in well deed reduce food prices, or at least make farming more profitable to make it even more competitive and make us more competitive internationally, is important. That takes real leadership, though. That is the role of government, to set those big, lofty goals and putting in structures in place that allow for competitive pressures to our own advantage, as opposed to the system that's operating at the moment. And it just feels too often that we have these debates and then it's 10 years later where we go, oh yeah, we really should have done that. And I'm just wondering how bad it needs to get until government really does take on a genuine long-term policy settings. And in the space of food, again, one would think that should be one of the priorities. And I think that a government that did it properly, cooperatively, could actually get a political win out of it as well.
Hello, Andrew Ward from Regen Farmers Mutual. If it's all right, can I ask two questions?
Sure.
Sure. Thank you.
It's not the National Press Club where Laura will rouse on you.
I know though. Thank you, Matthew, for your talk. It's sort of a bit above where I operate, but I've got a bit of a focus within the mutual around the carbon market and the oncoming reporting requirements, whether that's AASF or Scope 1, 2 and 3. And I guess most of my farmers that I speak with, they're the bottom of the supply chain. They're the Scope 3 emissions to a lot of large organisations that are all starting to turn around and say, well, how do we measure our greenhouse gas intensity? CropLife and you specifically as sort of as farmers, Scope 1 emissions, you're our inputs. Yep. So I wondered whether you could, feeding the world subjects aside, talk to how CropLife and the industry is making it easier for farmers to report on our Scope 1 emissions through the inputs that we buy.
Thanks. Do you want to give me the second one up front too?
Sure. How then do you supply the other data that's coming after carbon, which is ESG, biodiversity, animal welfare, all of the ESG other numbers that come after that?
And this goes back to the fundamental position of realistic and objective reporting that is relative to an actual outcome as opposed to arbitrary numbers. And again, in the context that producing food's not optional. These are challenges that as an industry we also face because we have a high energy intensity to deliver a lot of our products. And again, that is why we would suggest that in these reportings it needs to be realistically managed to the end output. And so if you have some inputs that do arbitrarily have a high, just individually assessed without any reference to how farmers are going to use them, have a high one, but they actually deliver a substantial net benefit in ESG in the total end point, then that's how we've got to do reporting for all of farming. And I suppose this is really core to my point, is for agriculture, ESG reporting needs to be the full vertical integration, which those who are asking for change should welcome, that we're going to capture the whole lot. But it needs to be both in the positive and net terms of how that all is delivered, and that one component might individually have a higher ESG rating. But if it delivers the 100-fold benefit in an environmental sustainability outcome improvement, then surely that's how we need to be making those decisions. Our industry sort of already has a long history, right down to just the improvements in synthetic chemistry of these days, compared to 50 years ago, the actual amount of active that is used per tonne of crop production is about 1/10 what it was 10 years ago. You know, the toxicity assessment, the use of pesticides compared to crop production and outcome is substantially lower than any time since we've been providing them. And so they're the sorts of things that all industries need to look at, because it is a driver in our own ESG approach. Our top 10 member companies alone would be dropping anywhere between $10 and $20 billion in R&D every year. A lot of that is driven to better ESG outcomes, and it's a point. It's a point that we used to have a difficult discussion, particularly perhaps with some on the coalition side in those early days of climate change debates, where as a science-based industry, we've had no doubt about climate change and the impacts and what drives it, because as an industry, for more than a couple of decades, we've been investing billions of dollars to equip farmers with new innovations, whether it's in biotech innovation or in chemistry, to prepare to be able to cope for farming in what will be a very challenging climatic condition. So we've never, as a science-based industry, we follow the science, and off the back of following the science, our member companies, went to hardcore commercial decisions about where they're investing, knowing that we're facing very significant changes, which is why we'll look to support any measures to mitigate climate change where we can. But again, it goes back into that context of proper reporting on this, because you do an individual report on any one component of ag, where you will successfully probably justify how you shut down every component of ag, as opposed to doing a genuine ESG assessment through the entire supply chain to improve the net outcome at the end. We obviously also, through our mandatory code of conduct and the right, drive members to innovate for better outcomes. And I think, quite frankly, as the ABARES report confirms, it's those innovations that are actually delivering real outcomes, and it's certainly one we're going to continue to focus on.
Could that look like reporting on the carbon intensity of glyphosate and fertiliser in the coming years, and/or could that look like reporting on the biodiversity impact as well as the carbon intensity in coming years? And how does this distribution, how do you swallow that beast? Yeah.
Well, and there lies the problem, and that's well beyond my pay grade.
I did, boss.
But herein lies the critical component, because if we do genuine reporting on data, science policy about the real sustainable, environmental sustainability outcomes of cropping, then nobody who declares that they're an environmentalist cannot support synthetic chemistry and GM crops. And if they're going to scrape away their, or their preconceived ideas and what they're entrenched in, if they're genuinely going to do it on data and science, then you've got to have environmentalists understand that these are the technologies that actually underpin real environmental sustainability. But still, in the paradigm, we've got to produce food, and that's the one exception that needs to happen in public policy. Politicians need to have that discussion that it's still got to be done, in that we can't just opt out of this. And so that's why they need to really look at how ESG reporting is done for genuine outcomes.
Great. Oh, I always get one last question before we pull it up.
Look, the issue of values was brought up, but would you agree with the proposition that values is really just a euphemism for subjectivity?
Yeah. Or whatever political agenda's running at the moment, and they change. They're not consistent. They're dynamic. The issues that modern ag are dealing with today are vastly different to a few years ago. I think we'll end up coming full circle if we keep on if we keep on seeing, a real. Two things happened in the last few years. One, we went to what I call the technology bonus of ag tech. For the first time in modern agricultural history, we saw production continue to increase, while total land under agriculture started to reduce. We've been increasing land and increasing productivity for a long time, and it's only in the last decade we've seen that separate. And we are now living in the period of genuine technology benefit in agriculture. And that gap, that's a real ESG gap on its own, a benefit, where all of a sudden the massive improvement in productivity off fewer resources and less land is very visible. But the other thing that's also happened, for the first time in more than 3 or 4 decades, is the global hunger index has also got worse. And so that dichotomy is very challenging, and that is one that does fall to political leadership and good public policy, and that's what they need to address. But I think if we keep going, we're going to get back to hopefully a more balanced perspective where we can, they are not mutually exclusive positions of protecting our natural environment, of addressing climate change, and still being able to feed the world. But the technology is there. Farmers have the capability, skill and dedication to it. It just means that we need to make sure we don't see severe warping of agronomic policy that prevents farmers from actually doing it.
Great, thank you.